Today's event will be covering resilient communities and will include issue papers crafted by over 150 plus environmental network partners. As a reminder, these events are meant to highlight the individual chapters of our briefing book with over 40 issue papers contained within them. As a reminder, and as you've heard, these events will be recorded and will be posted later on our Facebook page and eventually on our website. Like I said, today's chapter is Resilient Communities. Without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Pat, our Senior Policy and Campaigns Manager. Thank you very much, Pat.
Thank you, Kyle. This is Pat Calvert. Unable to start my video. If the host can allow me to do that, I will make that possible. But I want to thank you all for being here this afternoon now to hear from some of our co-authors of papers in the briefing book. So we'll hear from Stuart Schwartz from the Coalition for Smarter Growth on the boosting smart growth. Jay Ford, Chesapeake Bay Foundation on ensuring the resilience of Virginia's flood-prone communities. Justin Doyle of James River Association is going to be talking with us about ensuring daily access to the outdoors for all Virginians. And then Sarah Sanford from East Coast Greenway Alliance will speak to us about increasing support for trails. But without further ado, I would like to also introduce our today's guest speaker, many of whom you are, I'm sure, familiar with. There we go. Now I've got video. It's Andrea McClellan. Thank you for joining us, Andrea. I'll give you as brief a bio as I can, but it's tough to do because she's so involved and a champion for resilience in Virginia. So Andrea was elected to the Norfolk City Council since in 2016 and represents Super Ward 6. And correct me if I get anything wrong here. You're chair of the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission, where you serve as chair of the Coastal Resilience Subcommittee and the Legislative Committee. If that's not enough, she's also the chair of the Transportation District Commission of Hampton Roads, where she serves as the chair of the Smart Cities and Innovation Committee, co-chairs the Mayor's Commission on Social Equity and Economic Opportunity. A few years ago, co-chaired the Mayor's Commission on Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation, creating the region's first ever climate action plan, and have been appointed to the Virginia Joint Subcommittee on Coastal Flooding and the Local Government Advisory Committee of the Chesapeake Bay Program, and serves on the Virginia Municipal League's Environmental Quality Policy Committee. So without further ado, I want to hand it over to Andrea. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks, Pat. I really appreciate that. I will add, I also serve on the Elizabeth River Trail Foundation board. So trails are near and dear to my heart as well. And before I served in elected office, I was on the Planning Commission for the city of Norfolk. And so smart growth, which we'll be talking about today, is also something that's really important to me. And, if you think about all of these issues, moving forward as elected officials, we need to champion everything that can be considered dual benefit, co-benefit projects. We could be talking about Chesapeake Bay water quality as well as flood mitigation, for example, getting outdoors and improving our air quality, ensuring that we have fewer single occupancy vehicles on the road and supporting our bike lanes and more public transit. So I think we need to make sure that we're always recognizing the co-benefits of projects. And moving forward, the reason that I do what I do, as many of us do, is because of my 3 boys and future generations. But I will tell you that climate change is not a future issue, as we all know. It is a now issue. And I don't know if I can bring this up or not, if y'all can see from my camera, but the road that I travel to City Hall, which is literally half a block from my house, this is what it looked like yesterday. You can't see, you can see my ring light. Let me just tell you, I'll paint a picture. It was flooded. No precipitation, sunny day, water coming up through the storm drains. This is what's happening in Norfolk and a lot of our coastal communities. But when you add in the precipitation events that we're seeing as a result of climate change. It is truly the perfect storm. But this is something that's happening throughout the entire Commonwealth of Virginia, and that's why I've been advocating for the creation of a Commonwealth Flood Board to deal with flooding statewide. But resilience has many facets, and I think we always need to stop and define what we mean by resilience. Some people think of it just as synonymous with flooding, but it has also to do with the urban heat island effect that we're seeing so around the Commonwealth. It can deal with droughts as well. So I think we need to be very intentional when we use the word resilience, and I hope you will clarify for each of the presentations today how you deem that. But it is important, and it is important as a Commonwealth as we start to experiencing more and more of these climate-related environmental tragedies, for lack of a better term, that we as a state are prepared to build back better, to thrive as we come out of these events. So I appreciate the Virginia Conservation Network for inviting me here today. I can't wait to hear these great presentations. I really appreciate the work you do and your annual report that you provide to the legislators. It's really important that we continue to advocate and educate our elected officials in the Virginia General Assembly, and look forward to following your work and working alongside you to advocate for it in the future on resilient projects. So without further ado, I know you all are here to listen to these great speakers and not me. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Pat, and I will retire in the background and listen along with everybody else.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you very much. And letting everybody know that after all of today's presentations, we'll have time at the end for Q&A. So you've got a handy little button, hopefully at the bottom of your screen, that says Q&A. Feel free to enter questions into there, and presenters will respond to those after all the presentations have concluded. So at this point, I want to hand it right over to Stuart Schwartz with the Coalition for Smarter Growth on boosting smart growth.
Thank you, Pat, and thank you, Andrea, for just giving us a great intro and for all your great work down where land use has never been more complicated down in the Norfolk area. I'll share my own picture here from our own Bill Pugh from an event we had last night in Alexandria. We did a walking tour, an urbanism walking tour and social hour. And as the tide came up, this is what the streets looked like near our latest streeteries. So, and you might note that there's somewhat of a metaphor here. We have an electric bike in the picture. I'll stop sharing that. Now, you know me, I normally love a lot of slides. I do not have slides today. I think I'm going to try to draw a picture for you. The CSG, Coalition for Smarter Growth, that I lead has been around for 25 years now. We also have the Partnership for Smarter Growth in Richmond. But probably my roots in these issues goes back to perhaps how many decades ago, I won't even say, that I went to the University of Virginia, saw the beautiful Shenandoah Mountains, the beautiful Blue Ridge coming down 29. And, you know, what we love about our Commonwealth are its beaches and its rivers and its parks and its mountains and its scenic landscapes and its great cities and historic towns. And what we don't love and what we spend most of our time dealing with, or most people deal with, is sitting in traffic. We watch the roads being expanded almost nonstop. We watch the forests come down and development go up, and not all of it well planned, a lot of it not. Smart growth, I think Andrea talked about dual benefits and co-benefits. To some of us, we're a little biased, but smart growth is the unifying theory of everything. That where we grow and how we grow affects so many of the challenges we're facing, yet offers so many benefits if we can develop in a sustainable way. And that's what boosting smart growth is about. So in this paper, we talk about the problems of sprawl in Virginia, the fact that it leads to more traffic, obviously loss of farms and forests, and more driving, which is a key factor in climate change. Many of you were perhaps in the transportation session. There was a lot of overlap with what we're talking about here. Our growth in vehicle miles traveled is leading to growth in climate emissions. And as Bill Pugh from our team has made clear through his research, is we cannot fight climate change and slash emissions like we need to by 2030 and 2050 just by electric vehicles. We are going to need every tool in the toolbox, and a key tool is smart growth. We need to focus growth in our cities and our towns and in more walkable, transit-oriented communities in our suburbs. And we need to stop sprawling and being so auto dependent. So that's what boosting smart growth is about. There are challenges, though, in getting the state and local governments to work together on this. The local governments in particular are defensive about their rights and killed a couple bills last year that involved some more direction from the Commonwealth about their land use. But we've structured this paper in an important way. It's always about following the money. So the first thing is that we would like to see the state adopt legislation mandating that maintenance and replacement of aging infrastructure come first, a fix-it-first policy, which would also honestly include resilience investments and adaptation investments. We could spend every last dime of our tax dollars just doing that. We simply don't have the money to just keep expanding infrastructure into new greenfields areas. So we think the state should fully fund and address it should study its needs and fix poor infrastructure first before funding new infrastructure, and should do so within 10 years. That's first. Second, in terms of this relationship with local governments, it's a bipartisan thing. I remember Republicans saying they were tired of writing checks for sprawl and all the traffic. And this was in the 2000s when we first passed Smart Scale. And that was the impetus for Smart Scale, to use our money more wisely. So we should have a points system for all of our infrastructure dollars from the state. And it should be prioritized to those communities with transit-oriented communities, walkable transit-oriented places. That's where we should prioritize our infrastructure investments, but also to those communities that are providing the range of housing affordability and housing that their workforce needs, because affordable housing has become such a crisis. In addition, we want the Affordable Housing Trust Fund increased to $200 million. And certainly the state of Virginia can do that. Right now, DC has raised its Affordable Housing Trust Fund to $400 million a year. And so Virginia's down, I can't remember, around $40 million. We can easily do $200 million for affordable housing in the right locations. In fact, affordable housing in the right locations is the best transportation solution we could provide, along with many other social benefits that comes with it. But we also want to tackle some other things. We need more choice in housing. We need to end any bans on multifamily development in any jurisdiction. We need to lower minimum lot sizes so we can provide different size housing. And we need to make inclusionary zoning, the inclusion of affordable housing, an available tool for every jurisdiction, not just a few in the Commonwealth. And last but not least, we absolutely have to study the racial inequities in our land use and our planning and zoning, and remove those racial inequities as much as possible. I will wrap up with two things. Number one, if you know legislators are interested in this, have them contact me. Let me know who those legislators are. We might have a state senator interested in this where we spend our dollars issue. But I'm also going to make it one pitch on the federal level, just so you know the problems and challenges we face. The bipartisan infrastructure bill, the highway component of it is 80%, transit is just 20%. And in fact, they cut the transit by 10 billion to get to that 20% number. So the highway part of the bill is also a problem. While bridges are have fix-it-first requirements, highways do not. It's a blank check. So we are looking for further fixes in the reconciliation bill. If we don't get the climate and additional transit and reconciliation, we will have lost a key opportunity. So stay in touch with your state senators and delegates, but also don't forget our federal senators and congressmen. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. So clearly connected to boosting smart growth is flood resilience. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jay Ford, who worked along with several, a diverse group of individuals, partners, to draft a paper titled Ensuring the Resilience of Virginia's Flood-Prone Communities. It's all yours, Jay. Jay, you are muted.
Thank you. Can you see my screen, Pat?
Indeed.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. I'm Jay Ford. I'm the Virginia Policy and Grassroots Advisor with Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And as Pat said, I've worked on this paper with a number of very talented co-authors from both the Environmental Defense Fund, Wetlands Watch, and CCAN. And I just want to say at the top that flood-prone communities is in many ways a polite term of art for all of the water that climate change is going to move around the Commonwealth. And it helps us think about this in a more manageable way, but I'd like to just note that at the top that what we're discussing is climate change impacts on the Commonwealth, many of which have to do with how much water we're going to have to deal with in coastal communities, and as we'll discuss, really statewide. So what we're going to try and do today is briefly tackle what the flurry of activity has been here in the Commonwealth the last 2 years. And then we will hit on our policy recommendations for moving forward. So first, the challenge. I think unless you've been living under a rock, you probably have heard of climate change and sea level rise. Many people, if you're not in Southampton roads, may not be as aware of really just the extent and the fierce immediacy of now when it comes to sea level rise and recurrent flooding. And that is because Virginia's eastern seaboard really is ground zero for relative sea level rise on the entire East Coast. Because of a combination of subsidence, as well as sea level rise and increased rainfall, it's really produced some of the fastest growing levels of relative sea level rise. And as Andrea pointed to in the beginning, it's here now. This is something that our communities are dealing with on a daily basis. In addition to that, increased rainfall intensity and totals they're adding additional pressures to recurrent flooding in our coastal communities, but they're also creating unprecedented situations in communities around Virginia that aren't necessarily on the coast. The impacts are also threatening a lot of our longstanding investments. When you think about things like tributary cleanup or restoring the Chesapeake Bay or protecting wetlands, these are things that Virginia has spent hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions, on over the years. And climate change presents a unique challenge that to set back these efforts. And so, as Andrea also mentioned, looking for potential co-benefits where we can deal with these rising seas in a manner that either protects or enhances water quality has to be our top priority in the conservation community. Climate impacts and equity, we could talk about this for hours because the impacts it's impossible for me to overstate how disproportionate the impacts of climate change are on vulnerable communities. For our purposes today, I want to briefly touch on those areas that overlaps with flooding. And that's because this is really a big part of the state's role here, is to make sure that our response to flooding is done in an equitable fashion. A lot of these communities were really set up to become flood prone, and that's because they were put on undesirable lands, areas that were prone to flooding before we had any idea what sea level rise would do to our communities. Our low-income communities also have limited resources to address rising waters on their own. And because of the fact that they are oftentimes a smaller piece of the tax base, when localities are looking at statewide and regional plans, these communities often fall down the list because they have limited resources and they're trying to maximize their ability to protect the tax base. So there are a lot of structural things that work against our low-income communities getting the necessary resources to adapt to these rising waters. And because of that, we need to take additional care and make sure that state structures reflect this reality and have the resources to do the outreach needed. So what is Virginia doing? Virginia, as I said, has undergone a flurry of activity in the last couple of years. Right now, we are headed towards a December deadline for the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. And this is the first attempt by the state to offer a regional statewide roadmap on our response to recurrent flooding. As I've already noted, this is a coastal resilience master plan, but we are all aware that the impacts from climate change and flooding are really a statewide issue, something that we'll return to in a little bit. The coastal regional master plan, in addition to offering sort of this big picture view, has also done some project prioritization. And these are projects that were submitted by local planning district commissions and localities. I will say one shortcoming of that process has been that rather than developing a list of projects the state needs, they were limited to evaluating which projects were submitted. And those two things are not necessarily one and the same. The last thing I would point out about the Coastal Resilience Master Plan is this process has been run through an executive order. And so as we're preparing for a new administration, the CRMP could be ephemeral. New administration can decide they're not going to continue this work, and that would be the end of it. And as such, one of our recommendations is that this gets moved into Virginia code, and we'll talk about that in a second. One of the other big advancements has been the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. This are dollars that have been generated when Virginia entered the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. It's a big win in that not only are we drawing down emissions, but this is the first time there are actual dollars allocated for this resilience work. The CFPF included language that says 25% of the fund must be dedicated to low-income communities, which we think was an important step toward dealing with some of these climate equity issues. This fund, the first round of grants were just issued yesterday, and the second grant round will close in early November, with a third coming shortly thereafter. This is something we probably could talk about for an hour in of itself, but I encourage you all to speak with your localities and make sure that they're aware of the fund and participating in it if possible. It is a statewide fund. Two other quick things: the tidal wetlands guidance. This is a big deal. This is really our frontline defense in permitting, and for the first time in Virginia's history, you are required to use a living shoreline unless the best available science indicates otherwise. And that is really a huge change in how we treat our coastlines, and gives a big leg up to protecting the sensitive ecosystems that are there, as well as making our coastlines more resilient as these nature-based systems do a better job protecting against nutrient runoff and managing incoming water. And the last thing I want to mention is the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act Resilience Update, also completed last year, and the technical group is meeting now. This is sort of the next level beyond the tidal wetlands guidance, and also can set out some guidance for accounting for sea level rise for the first time. So where do we need to go? That was a lot. This is 9 minutes is reckless for this topic, but I appreciate everybody sticking with it. So I identified the fact that the Coastal Regional Master Plan exists as an executive order. We've also talked about the fact that it needs to be statewide. So one of our first recommendations is to protect those advances by codifying that. Let's get the master plan into code, and let's make sure that we make it statewide. The other part is codifying the operation and governance of the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. Currently, that fund is managed by DCR, and the ultimate decision is made by the Secretary of Natural and Historic Resources. There's a lot of discussion about opening that process up to a little more transparency, and that is why we've included it here as well. Our next recommendation really deals with the equity piece. These community flood preparedness funds, they're really geared towards community, regional, and statewide projects. But as many of our partners have pointed out, Virginia still does not have sufficient resources to help individual homeowners in our low-income communities. And that is a tool we need to continue to develop moving forward. And finally, the buck stops with the locality, and we have got to get our localities to start incorporating climate change and the resulting impacts in their comprehensive plans. If they are not accounting for it, their plans are going to run into trouble because climate change has thrown a monkey wrench in all of our planning. So we're hoping that the legislators will see the wisdom of that and add it into the comprehensive plan. All right, I think it probably went over, but here's a turtle to make it better. And I look forward to follow-up conversation.
Thanks, Jay. And thank you for the Eastern Box turtle. Without further ado, I'd say particularly during the pandemic, we've seen an expanded use of outdoor green areas and trails. And our next two papers are largely resulting from that that need for all Virginians. So with that, I'm going to hand it right over to Justin Doyle, James River Association, to tell us about making certain that Virginians have daily access to the outdoors.
Thanks so much, Pat, and good afternoon, everyone. I co-wrote Ensuring Virginians Have Daily Access to the Outdoors with my colleagues, Parker Agelasto of the Capital Region Land Conservancy, Kat Anthony of the Virginia Capital Trail Foundation, and Linda Frost of the Trust for Public Land. And this policy paper builds on a paper that Kat Anthony and I co-wrote for our common agenda last year. And it emphasizes the importance of daily access to the outdoors for all Virginians, and not just those among us who are able to jump in a car and travel to one of our wonderful state parks, natural area preserves, state forests, or wildlife management areas. And we approached this paper with the idea that everyone should reside within a 10-minute walk of a park or green space. Next slide, please. For too many Virginians, parks and public lands are inaccessible due to distance, uneven distribution across the Commonwealth, and lack of facilities compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Furthermore, within local communities, race and income play a role in determining the quality and size of parks and green spaces individuals have access to. More affluent and predominantly white neighborhoods tend to have access to higher quality park systems with more acreage than those with larger low income and Latinx or Black populations. And this reality is abundantly clear here in the city of Richmond, where I live. And we must address these inequities by helping communities create new close to home parks and green spaces. Investments in new public access infrastructure and facilities must be designed and constructed to accommodate people of all abilities to promote inclusion, and programs that connect people to our state's public lands and trails must be adopted too. So next slide, please. Some solutions to the challenges I just mentioned include identifying communities across the Commonwealth that have poor access to parks and green spaces by creating a statewide outdoor access equity model with guidance provided by stakeholders, including local park and recreation agencies. Ensuring resources are available to fund park and green space and public access infrastructure projects by increasing annual funding to the Virginia Land Conservation Fund. Doing so will increase the funding available for community park and green space projects, including those funded through the Virginia Outdoors Foundation's Preservation Trust Fund and their new Get Outdoors grant programs. Using state bonds to make outdoor infrastructure investments at Virginia's state parks, natural air preserves, and along statewide trails and bodies of water. Also expanding the uses of the Virginia Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund to include the ability to fund parks and green infrastructure projects in localities with high poverty rates and poor access to parks and green spaces where the fund has flexibility to forgive portions of debt. And finally, providing funding to the Department of Conservation and Recreation to hire staff to provide technical assistance to local governments interested in applying to grant programs, including federal grant programs such as Land and Water Conservation Fund. So some policy recommendations that we came up with, that directly respond to those solutions. And next slide, please. Include directing the Department of Conservation and Recreation to create a statewide outdoor access equity model with guidance provided by stakeholders. And there are a number of models that exist across the country that could be referenced to achieve this policy goal. Fully funding the Virginia Land Conservation Fund at $40 million annually. Creating a new outdoor recreation community access grant program that gives communities the ability to better plan their outdoor recreation infrastructure investments. And next slide, please. Expanding the use of the Virginia Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund to invest in community green infrastructure. Funding public access infrastructure projects, including roads, parking, trails, and facilities for disabled access at Virginia state parks, natural area preserves, statewide trails, and along bodies of water, using $115 million in bonds as recommended by Virginia Forever. They released a 5-year plan a few years ago that included this recommendation. And that funding would be critically important in achieving that policy recommendation. And then finally, hiring 4 additional full-time employees in the Department of Conservation and Recreation for the purpose of leveraging grant funding from federal grant programs and providing local governments with technical assistance. So that concludes my presentation. I think for those of you who are here today, there are some exciting opportunities coming your way, to advocate for this needed funding to ensure that all Virginians have access to the outdoors on a daily basis. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. As I stated at the beginning, we'll hang around after presentations because our presenters are going to field your questions that you add to the Q&A. Right now, I've got none, so you might get out of this early unless you have some good questions for some folks. So now's the time to ask. And piggybacking on the access to the outdoors closely is support for trails. So I'm going to hand it over to Sarah Sanford.
Thanks, Pat, and hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. My name is Sarah Sanford, and I'm with the East Coast Greenway Alliance. I was one of the co-authors on the Increasing Support for Trails briefing paper. Other folks involved were Kat Anthony with Virginia Capitol Trail Foundation, Wendy Austin with Friends of the Lower Appomattox River, and Kyle Lawrence with the Shenandoah Valley Bicycle Coalition. So I'd like to just give a brief overview of where we were coming from and also our policy recommendations. So trails in so many ways are so relevant to the pandemic and to right now because we already knew before the pandemic that trails were incredibly important resources for public health, economic development, transportation, and of course for the environment. But I think what the pandemic did was made that even more apparent. So you can look at the data and it'll all show that trails became just such a vital resource for everyone during the pandemic. In fact, there was a recent Virginia Outdoors Demand Survey that showed that 43% of Virginians ranked trails as the most needed recreational opportunity. So in Virginia, we have these amazing trails like the Elizabeth River Trail that was mentioned at the beginning, the Virginia Creeper Trail, the High Bridge Trail, Appalachian Trail, the Virginia Capitol Trail, and many, many others that would take way too long to mention. And we know that trail use on every single one of these trails, whether it was hiking, biking, paddling, horseback riding, absolutely skyrocketed during the pandemic. People were using trails more than we've ever seen them use them before. However, the challenge here in Virginia is that these trails that we all love so much are mostly underfunded and understaffed and overused. I will say that that last part, the overused aspect, is a good problem to have in terms of issues to have. So the good news is we have a solution to these challenges. And that solution is actually pretty simple. It is dedicated and stable funding for both trail construction and planning. And that is one of the most important things that I'm going to talk about in the slide deck we have here today. So dedicated funding, aka recurring funding. So one-time pots of money are of course helpful, but trails take years to plan and to build. And you simply can't develop trails across Virginia with only non-recurring funding that comes once in a while. And the other important point I'm going to harp on is trail planning. Typically, we think of just trail construction, which is the shiny, exciting part that we all love. But the not so shiny part is trail planning and engineering, and that costs money too. So we need dedicated funding for that part too. So to move into the policy recommendations that we set forth, if you go to the next slide, please. Our first main one is funding for both VDOT and to DCR for trails. So of course, VDOT typically covers the more the paved trails like the Virginia Capitol Trail, for example. DCR tends to do the natural surface trails. So we're recommending $20 million to VDOT for construction of paved trails, but also for feasibility and engineering studies. In addition to that, we're recommending 2 full-time employees to help handle and distribute this funding. And it's essentially the same recommendation for Virginia DCR, $20 million for both construction and also for trail planning and feasibility studies. Again, this would be for the natural surface trails versus paved trails. Next slide, please. The second big policy recommendation we have is financial assistance with the matches for trail grants and with tourism, trail tourism. So we're recommending $1 million in funding for grant matching funds for low-income communities, communities of color, and smaller localities with very small populations. So this is often a barrier for these communities, is the match rates for these grants. So if you are an under-resourced community and the matching rate for your trail grant is 20%, that's actually quite high, and many communities cannot afford to pay a 20% match rate. So a big part of our recommendation is making sure the communities who want and need these grants can afford the match as well. The other part of this, of course, is trail tourism, and we're recommending $100K for these communities to promote trail tourism in partnership with the Virginia Tourism Corporation. So that means help with marketing, branding, internet presence, social media presence, etc., to reap the benefits that come from trail tourism. Next slide, please. And the last big policy recommendation we have is creating a funded state trail system. So we do have statewide trails in Virginia. You can go to DCR's webpage and you can see the different statewide trails, such as the East Coast Greenway, Beaches to Bluegrass Trail, etc. But this is a system that is not legislatively involved or has dedicated funding. So we're recommending creating a legislative process for designating select trails as official state trails in Virginia. This is something that is done in other states. North Carolina, for example, has a very successful state trail system that comes with funding for both planning and for construction. And part of this system would involve directing those funding resources towards trail planning construction, so allocating to the localities that actually manage and own these trails. And of course, this would involve coordinating with DCR and with VDOT, depending upon the type of trail. And what we've seen in other states is that creating an official system with a legislative process, it is a top-down approach that tends to make sure that funding is there and is available. And so yes, it can be cumbersome to have to pass a bill in order to designate a trail as a state trail. However, these types of top-down approaches tend to ensure both the funding and the resources to get these trails built and planned. So with that, I will go ahead and wrap it up and say I would encourage you to look at our actual whole briefing paper in the Our Common Agenda document. And in just a minute, we'll be doing questions. So I'm happy to answer any questions. If you want to email me, sarah@greenway.org is my address. And I am the last speaker for today, so I'm going to pass it back to Pat to handle the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And asking you shall provide. So I got lots of questions in during your section there. Thank you very much for that. Started off, Andrea just put one in. Thank you for being here, Andrea. She wanted to hear more details about Virginia's support of bike lanes beyond trails, which she also loves. So I don't know if anybody wants to take on bike lanes. Stuart, do you have any intel?
Well, VDOT has been supportive of bike facilities, or more supportive than in the past for bike facilities in conjunction with some of their large road projects, but that's not always our favorite necessarily. We'll take them, particularly done it as off-road shared paths, including, there was a big fight, but we got them to agree to do it along I-66. Again, not ideal. Senator Servo's among those working with the bike community for more dedicated funding through our state transportation fund direct into bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, whether trails or on-road protected bike lanes and features. And honestly, we would prefer to shift a lot more of the flexible transportation spending in the state just to complete streets work, the adding bike lanes, sidewalks on streets, and putting roads on road diets, and using the money for local street networks rather than large arterials. So a lot ahead of us, and we're also pushing really hard to tame all these arterials, get them redesigned. We're in a big fight in Fairfax County where suddenly VDOT wants to turn Route 1 into 13 lanes wide, counting 2 BRT lanes. And our feeling is when you add bus rapid transit, you shouldn't have to also add car lanes. So there's a few highlights. We've got a lot to do in terms of road design and channeling the funding to the bike ped investments we need.
Thank you, Stuart. Question from Jessica here. I'll read what it says. She lives in Virginia Beach. The flood protection program bond referendum is on the ballot for us this year in Virginia Beach. She says, I plan to vote in favor of it because I haven't seen any other proposals to seriously address flooding in Virginia Beach. However, I understand there may be nuances about this referendum that I'm not privy to. And I also wonder if this referendum would conflict with any state mandates that VCN partners support. Does VCN or our partners have any insight to offer regarding this particular referendum?
Hi, that feels like me. Thank you for the question, Jessica. And this is something that we've been thinking a lot about. The way that referendum's worded, it's really tied to specific project proposals that the city identified through a consulting process a few years back. I will say it's not in conflict with anything per se, but it may not line up with the identified prioritization in the Coastal Regional Master Plan. These are priorities that Virginia Beach has set out, and they did use a different set of standards for how they were making those determinations, where the Coastal Regional Master Plan had 5 principles to underpin that work, one of which was to really maximize the use of nature-based design to make sure that we were getting those co-benefits that Councilwoman McClellan referenced with water quality and flood protection. Additionally, the Coastal Master Plan contemplates the idea of retreat in a way that our cities aren't really able, I'm going to say charitably, they haven't gotten themselves there psychologically yet. So I would say that the referendum does not reflect either of those principles. So it's not directly in conflict, and those projects will have to go through the necessary permitting processes with either MRC or DEQ. And as I mentioned, both of them have updated their permits in the last year to be more protective around these resilience questions. So it's hard to say if anything will impede that project list, but it will probably have to meet a higher standard than when they originally contemplated those projects.
Hey, Jay, can I chime in here as well? Just as a reference for those who may not be familiar with our issues here in Hampton Roads. So for example, in the city of Norfolk, we've identified 1.5 billion with a B dollars of tidal flooding projects and another $1 billion of stormwater precipitation projects dealing with flooding. So as a region, I suspect we have about $40 billion in flood projects. Meanwhile, the state is really excited because we finally have dollars going to flooding in the amount of $80 to $100 million a year annually for the entire Commonwealth. So I just wanted to put that in sort of perspective of the enormity of what we're talking about. And so while I recognize the Virginia Beach referendum of $550 million, give or take a few million, seems like a lot, it's really a drop in the bucket. And absolutely, to Jay's point, we need to prioritize green infrastructure, but this is such a huge issue. And I just fear that our legislators have no concept of the enormity of what we're talking about and how we need to be working on this now. And I'm very hopeful that the infrastructure bill gets passed and we get started on these things. But anyway, I just wanted to put that sort of scoping in place. Hope that helps a little bit.
Thanks, Jay and Andrea. Here's another question from Robert. Land use open space is frequently used to shield land owned by the affluent from meaningful real estate taxes. Can the open space requirements be amended to require public access and public use and or parks?
I'll answer
Go ahead.
Mr. Walters' question, then I think I'll defer to Stuart to see if he has any additional thoughts. Yeah, first, it's an interesting suggestion. You know, and in my work on conservation easements, property owners who protect their land in conservation easement will sometimes make their land available to the public. And you know, some grants that help to protect land and easements do require public access. With that being said, I think your suggestion is something worth exploring. And I'll defer to Stuart to see if he has additional thoughts on that idea.
Well, Justin, I think you answered that really well. I'd have to really honestly defer to our land trust folks more about that. And certainly I would agree that you can write your easements to include public accessibility. I know some of the conservation that Piedmont Environmental Council has done has actually involved some outright purchase of land from some of these landowners and turn over to the parks authorities and so forth for public access, as well as I think some easements that they hold that also have public access to it. I don't forget that there are a lot of other conservation benefits we are getting from the land being there, even without the public access. You're getting forest protection, you're getting stream protection, watershed protection, drinking water supply protection, wildlife, a whole number of benefits, not to mention, of course, the scenic tourism values for the Commonwealth. So there are a lot of community benefits, and we wouldn't have the programs as we do without those.
Thank you both. Here's a good question. I'm thinking probably Sarah and Justin would be able to field this one. So would waterways, or blueways as they're sometimes called, and access to them be a part of the statewide trail system?
Yeah, I don't mind tackling that one first, and then I'll pass it to Justin. So they certainly can be. So for example, the state trail system I mentioned in North Carolina, yes, water trails are part of that. So many folks might have heard of the Mountains to Sea Trail, which goes east-west across North Carolina. And a good portion of it is a hiking trail, but a lot of it is also a paddle trail. So it's the Neuse River. You can follow the Neuse River all the way to the coast. And they have designated that as a state trail. And I will go ahead and answer another question that often comes up is, oh, but it doesn't take money to build paddle trails, does it? Because rivers already exist. They do cost money, and it's for the access points and for camping and lodging, etc. So boat access, canoe access, put in a camping platform on the water. So in terms of building the paddle trails, it can be very similar to building natural surface or paved trails. So yes, they absolutely can be part of a state trail system.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, you know, when we're advocating for funding for public access infrastructure, you know, we are always certain to keep our rivers and bodies of water in mind.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Here's a question from Vicky. Says, doesn't promotion of tourism conflict with the goal of reducing automobile use?
Sorry, repeat the question.
Stuart?
Repeat the question.
Yeah, the question is, if we're promoting tourism, does that not conflict with the goal of reducing automobile use?
Well, in that case, we hope those will be electric vehicles. You know, we're not talking about banning moving around by car in the future. They obviously have tremendous value for longer distance mobility, certainly. But we also have opportunities for tourism via rail, increasing by Virginia's record investment in our rail networks, which can bring tourists, you know, both to our beautiful coast and to our mountains. I think I'm seeing many older folks traveling by rail now, rather than having to deal with cars. And of course, tourism by bicycle is also happening with perhaps a park once policy. But you know, cars will be with us. Those that will be with us should be electric. In the meantime, let's talk about the vast majority of trips that we're all making, which are sort of our daily needs trips. About 20% of our daily trips are commutes. And that's a little bit less certainly right now with telecommuting and the pandemic. But so many of the trips are, you know, to school. Unfortunately, people driving their kids to school. There's shopping, all those sorts of things. And that's where our walkable communities are critical, our historic towns and cities and suburbs that are designed to be more like our historic towns and cities.
Hey, Stuart, I'm going to add in on that one as a owner of an electric vehicle for the past 3+ years. I'm really concerned that Virginia has not invested enough in our electric vehicle infrastructure. And potentially EV charging or EVs will become the redlining of this generation. You're going to have the haves and the have-nots. And so we've got to be intentional about ensuring that we have EV infrastructure, charging infrastructure in our marginalized communities. Otherwise, there's no way you can drive an electric vehicle if you don't have off-street parking, et cetera. So perhaps as DCR is considering grants, they're thinking about charging at our parking spaces as well. So anyway, I just think this is a huge issue that I know the Clean Car Initiative from the last General Assembly is starting to address, which I'm excited about, but I think it's something that we need to be thinking about further as a Commonwealth.
Pat, this is obviously in the VCN energy team's bailiwick as well as our transportation team. You know, I think there's a huge support for the charging infrastructure, the EV infrastructure as a major investment. There's a little more discussion though about the, you know, the rebates and subsidies and all those things for anybody, much less, but certainly for achieving equity, that's important. But we also don't want, if there's a major public dollars in that, we also don't want to lose the investment in transit that we certainly need for everybody as part of it. And then I wouldn't be fair to Wyatt Gordon if I didn't promote the fact that we're also looking for EV bike rebates. We think that would be a particularly high priority rebate that we ought to have because of their benefit for all those trips 3 miles or less.
Thank you both. Appreciate that. We're getting near the end of time. There are a couple other questions I will ask. I'll follow up with Vicki, Robert, and put you in touch with folks, or feel free to just email them directly. And Robert, your question about basically the tax shelter and its inequities. Happy to discuss that with you. We've got some folks really working on that in the land trust community. And I think it's a little bit bigger, but it certainly can be made more equitable. With that, I appreciate all of your time today. I'm going to hand it back over to Kyle.
Hi, everybody. Thank you again to our authors and to our guest speaker today. You guys are great as usual. Thank you so much. And thank you to our participants for coming out. The next event will be our Clean Energy Development briefing, which will be October 15th. And that I'm pretty sure it's next Friday. So get excited about that. But once again, thank you so much for everybody for showing up, and have a great rest of your 2 minutes of your lunchtime. Have a great one. Bye, everybody.